The village of Baggington has almost been swallowed up by the suburbs of Coventry. The distant, dull roar from the city's glass and concrete skyline is a constant reminder, and on the edge of the village there's a small airport. But sturdy resistance to their big neighbour must have played a part in preserving a corner of Baggington at its highest point. And it was there on a 4.5-acre site that archaeologists from Coventry Museum began to uncover the remains of a Roman fort. The Lunt, as it's called, a word that means wooded slope, had only been used for agriculture since the Romans marched away. And so in the mid-1960s, a rare opportunity presented itself for archaeologists to excavate a typical first-century turf and timber fort. Margaret Rylett, Coventry City's field archaeologist, began digging there in 1965, and as they gradually stripped the site layer by layer, she looked forward to uncovering and reconstructing a typical Roman fort. But as the excavation went on, an unexpected shape began to bother them.
When we laid out the area for excavation, we had our team working away quite happily, and one day a boy came to me and said, "I've got a slot in my trench, miss, but it's curving, you see." So I said to him, "Just go and carry on, and perhaps it'll go away. You don't have curved features in Roman forts."
Everything's a straight line.
Oh, yes, you see. So the next day he came to me and said, "You know that curving slot in my section? Yes, well, it's still curving." So I said, "Well, yes, all right, I'll have a look at it, and then we'll forget about it. Perhaps it's a rabbit run or something, you see." In the back of my mind, I thought perhaps it was a later feature, like a pond or something, you see. But when you get a half circle, then you can't ignore it, and you have to look at it seriously.
What emerged was a thing like a circus ring on one side of the fort, an architectural feature which has never before turned up in the whole of the Roman Empire. It was a stunning and puzzling discovery. The dates were not in question, with plenty of evidence to show that the first phase of the fort went back to the early conquest of Britain, and in particular to the time of the revolt led by the queen of the Iceni tribe of East Anglia, Boudica, in about 60 AD. Graham Webster, an archaeologist who's made a special study of the Roman army in Britain, looked at the Lunt, its position in the heart of England, its hurried construction, and realized that it must have played a major role in the aftermath of the great battle in which the Britons under Boudica were defeated.
I think as a campaign base, it would be an obvious place to bring all the spoils of war. The wealth of the tribes, which they'd put down, were distributed to the officers and men and the commander. And then, of course, they had to deal with all the animals, the draft animals and cavalry and untrained horses, animals for the cohortes equitata, and then the larger animals would be trained for the cracada, the big regiments, the fighting regiments.
So they built this corral specially for that purpose?
Indeed. And that is clear from the way it the later defences were put round it. If you look along there, you see this extraordinary sinuosity of the ditches and the rampart.
Yes, looking along the rampart
right.
From here,
yeah.
it describes a sort of dog's hind leg,
right.
Not straight at all, as one would expect.
No, that's not the norm, as you well know, which is this nice straight line with corners. No, that had to be put like that to contain this large circle in front of us, this corral or gyrus, because it was there already in the campaign depot. And they built, when they reduced the size of it, they brought the defences right up here and curved the defences round it.
I suppose there must have been a number of animals involved when they were clearing up after the revolt.
Very large number. After all, remember, it's not just the Iceni we're talking about, it's all the other tribes. Probably half the tribes of Britain were involved in this revolt, and that would have included some of the tribes on the South Downs, the Wessex tribes, the Durotriges, the southern half of the Debunny, and possibly others. We don't know. And all their horses would have been taken as the spoils of war, all brought here, I should think, hundreds, thousands of animals to be sorted out, and then the ones picked for army use would then have to be trained for their various jobs in the army, which was a very rigorous training discipline, as we know from Xenophon, who lays it down in his book on how to train horses for military uses.
How did they go about it?
Well, first of all, the horse had to be broken down and subject to complete discipline with its rider. And then They had jumping exercises. They constructed ditches, short lengths of ditches of various widths. They built banks of different heights, gradually increasing it. And then he has a wonderful passage about the use of steep slopes. Now, if you look over there, Malcolm, you see where that fence is. Now there, if you stand on the top, you'll find you're on a very, very steep escarpment.
Going right down to the river.
Little stream there, that's right. And this would have been ideal for taking these horses up and down a steep slope. And he describes how you've got to get them used to actually galloping up and down. Extraordinary, isn't it? But you see, it's necessary in war conditions.
So this was a very good place to have a cavalry training establishment.
Well, it seemed to me ideally situated.
The gyrus itself is a complete circle just over 100 feet in diameter, with a sunken floor 2 feet or so below ground level. The Romans then put up a sturdy wall of planks about 8 feet high, and standing in the centre, Margaret Rylott can clearly imagine what was going on here in the middle of the 1st century.
In here I can see, say, a dozen horses galloping around, perhaps 1 or 2 targets about too, that men can practice spearing, that kind of thing. Horses galloping around, as I said, with men on their backs, and you have the sound of their swords banging on their shields, creating a tremendous sound. And I think that one of the advantages of having this circular feature is you can simulate the noises of battle.
We can hear an echo as we talk now, can't we?
Right.
You can hear our voices coming back off the walls.
Yes. One hand clap will demonstrate, I think.
Yes, that's a marvellous noise, isn't it?
Right. Now, add to that men shouting, and not just men shouting in the gyrus. Around the edge of the gyrus, you have people looking in. And you know what soldiers are, of course. You get rude comments, and you'd have the officer shouting out orders, and a general cheering for your man, I suppose. All of these things, teaching the horse to work with his rider properly in battle conditions.
Margaret Rylott has herself schooled horses in the gyrus as an experiment and found that it works very well. Archaeological experiments, in fact, are an important aspect of the Lunt. An opportunity, for example, to reconstruct timber buildings using the sort of wood and techniques that the Roman army used as a matter of course. Although many Roman forts in stone have been preserved, a timber and turf fort of this period has not been reconstructed anywhere in the Roman world, another unique aspect of the Lunt. So far they've reconstructed the main gateway, built with massive timbers a foot square and topped by a balustraded second-storey lookout. A short section of the ramparts on either side of the gate has also been built up in turf and timber. But how do they know so precisely what the Roman legionaries had built almost 2,000 years ago?
We know from Roman writers how ramparts were constructed, and if you follow the instructions to the letter, you can build perfect Roman ramparts.
It's all written down in the military manuals.
Oh, yes. Oh, they had, yes, military manuals which have survived, and follow them to the letter. That's most important. And to begin with, if you're going to do experimental archaeology, you've got to start off with the right labour force. Everything must be right when you do it. And again, we were lucky. We had the right kind of labour force in prison labour. In those days, we had prisoners from Leicester and from Gartrey to carry out this kind of experiment for us. So we worked these prisoners exactly in the same way as Roman soldiers would have worked. First of all, we didn't use any modern tools. Roman ramparts, you see, are constructed of blocks of turf. They're 18 inches by 12 inches and 6 inches deep. I mean, these are formidable blocks of turf and a superb building material, of course.
And very heavy to carry around.
Very heavy. And they were carried on the backs of the soldiers but with 2 ropes. You can see this on Trajan's Ptolemy. Roman legionaries carrying turfs to build the ramparts.
How long did it take the prisoners to complete this section of the rampart?
About 10 days. And we had an average of 15 men. And we calculate that the 4.5 acres we have here could have been defended with ditch and rampart in about 10 days.
Just 10 days to build the entire fortifications?
Remember, they had more men, and we were talking about 500 men working on the defences.
And you worked this out by doing a time and motion study on them with a stopwatch?
That's right. The small section that we did build in 1966 is still experimental, because each year, for about 6 years after we actually built it, we used to section the ditch to see how often the Romans would have had to recut the ditches to make them work.
But when it came to building this massive gateway, I don't suppose the prisoners were able to help then?
No, not at all. They hadn't the facilities, for one thing. So we used British Army, the Royal Engineers. They prefabricated the gateway in their workshops and came along to the site and in one weekend actually put it up. There are no hidden nuts and bolts in this gate. It's held together by good jointing and oak pegs.
Again in the Roman way?
Yes, and iron bolts, of which we found masses when we excavated the gateway area.
How can you be certain, though, that this is how it would have looked?
You must, first of all, work with the archaeological evidence. I mean, that's extremely important, isn't it? And we know that it was a double portal gateway because we had 6 posts. The 6 major posts are standing in the Roman post holes, so we know this is exactly where it stood. The height can be calculated by the depth of the post holes.
And the design?
And the design is based on gateways that you can see on Trajan's Column, which stands in Rome. And on Trajan's Column there are about 52 gates of this design.
Up to date, only a fraction of the Lunt, which was once crammed with buildings, has been reconstructed. On the way to the biggest one they've attempted so far, Margaret Rylott led me along the main street running through the fort.
The Via Principalis, in fact, the road that runs past the Principia, or the headquarters building. At the same time, we will pass the commander's house, the Praetorium.
That's on the left there.
It is on our left, yes.
And barracks here,
yes.
Again on the left. And then on the right, which we're coming up alongside now, a great granary.
Yes.
The only major building that you've reconstructed here. It's enormous, isn't it?
It is, it's huge.
30 feet across here at the front.
By 70 feet. Always working in units of 10 feet, see the Romans.
Where did you get the materials to build such a thing?
I always answer this by saying it's an ill wind that blows no one any good. And when Dutch elm disease was rife in Warwickshire, we had the opportunity of purchasing this quite cheaply.
We're standing at the front of the granary now, and this, you say, would be the loading bay here. This came from the pictures as well,
yes.
On Trajan's Column.
Yes, and you can see how it worked. You come down, a cart comes down the main road, along the road, and we've just walked along, backs up onto the granary, and the grain is offloaded from a cart into the granary.
And these steps here take us up onto the loading bay, and then into the granary itself. I noticed as I looked underneath the foundations here, or underneath the building, it's raised up on stilts, and there seem to be hundreds of piles on which this building is put.
That's quite right. A granary has to be raised off the ground because in it you're storing grain. And if you're storing grain, the most important thing is to keep it dry. By raising it off the ground, you see the air can circulate right round the building, keeping it quite free of damp.
As we step through these double doors off the loading bay and into the building itself, we can see how it was laid out with the grain bins on either side.
That's right. Always working in units of 10 feet. A granary has to hold enough grain for 1 year for a cohort. That's about 480 men, you see. And the capacity of the bins is worked out accordingly.